To step inside them is to enter another world. At least that was the idea. It's located underground, beneath a hill in West Wickham, just outside of London, England. And by it, I mean the caves. You enter them through a rather imposing set of iron gates that are situated beneath the ruins of what looks like an old church. There had always been natural caves there, but in the 1750s, a local man named Francis paid a bunch of out-of-work farmers to widen and deepen it all, using the chalk debris as road material throughout town. What they created was a system of hand-cut rooms and passageways that looked something like it came out of a medieval fantasy movie. And each chamber has a name, too. The entrance hall, the triangle, the miner's cave, the steward's chamber. You get the idea. There's even one called Franklin's Cave, but I'll get to that in a moment. Nearly a quarter of a mile down the path, rumored to be directly below the church that stands at the top of the hill, is the final destination, a place called the Inner Temple. You can walk right up to that room today, but back in the 1750s, it was actually cut off from the rest of the rooms by an underground river that was named, appropriately, the River Styx. All of this, by the way, was crafted so that Francis had a place to hold meetings of a rather unusual social gathering. His full name was Sir Francis Dashwood, and his social group was known as the Hellfire Club, and they gathered for all sorts of rituals and celebrations. Oh, and the Franklin Cavern I mentioned a moment ago, it was named after one of the group's members, Benjamin Franklin. For as long as we've had society, there have been groups that seem to exist outside it. Some have been secret, while others have put themselves on full display. But if the story of one group in particular is true, they should all be treated with caution, because some paths into the occult only lead to destruction. I'm Aaron Mankey, and this is Lore. His arrival in America was really what started it all. Benjamin had been born in a little village north of Naples, Italy back in 1886, the same year that Coca-Cola was invented, by the way. But in 1904, he and his brother Antonio packed up and moved to the United States, chasing after the promise of a better life. Benjamin and his brother settled in Philadelphia, taking on tough, labor-intensive jobs. But early on, cracks appeared in their relationship. It's said that his very devout Catholic brother wasn't too fond of Benjamin's interests in the occult. Unable to get along, Benjamin left the big city to find work elsewhere. And for a while, that was York, Pennsylvania. And I've not seen anyone else notice this, but I find it more than coincidental that an occult-obsessed man would travel to one of the hotbeds of witchcraft in America at the time. Heck, just a few years later, in 1929, the York witch trials would take place, where the occult murder of a local white magic practitioner named Nelson Raymeyer would be convicted. In York, folks believed in the supernatural. After that, he married a fellow Italian immigrant named Santina, and the couple started trying to build a typical American life together. But that was a steep hill to climb in that era. You see, the last couple of decades of the 1800s and the first couple of the 1900s were the years when a massive wave of Italian immigrants came to America. I have Italian ancestors through my maternal grandmother's side of the family, and they arrived inside that window. But America didn't treat them kindly. They were branded with stereotypes and pushed to the fringes of society, setting most of them on a path into deep poverty and inequality. And this was what Benjamin and his wife found themselves facing. Of course, he did everything that he could to fit in. He went by Benny. He gave his last name an American makeover, and he worked really hard. But it wouldn't be until they moved to Detroit, Michigan that things started to improve. Yes, their financial situation got better. Benny invested in real estate, transforming himself from a tenant into a landlord. But the biggest change he experienced was a new focus, a new goal, and it started with the dreams. Remember, Benny had always been interested in the occult. It's what had led to a falling out between him and his brother Antonio. It had been the foundation of close friendships, like fellow Italian immigrant and rail yard worker Aurelius Angelino back in Pennsylvania. If he was awake, he was thinking about the world beyond our own and how he could harness it. Even in his own dreams, He was obsessed with it. In those dreams, Benny believed that he was receiving visions from God, visions of a mission where he was meant to embark on a very specific calling. Benny, it seems, was supposed to become a healer and a prophet, and it was in Detroit that he finally leaned into those dreams and made them a reality. You see, Benny and his wife still lived within a pretty tight-knit Italian community, and as his work as a healer and prophet began to increase, people around him noticed and they paid attention. Over time, those ideas that he had about world history became the subject of a book that he wrote, The Oldest History of the World, Discovered by Occult Science. But mostly he focused on his sermons, gatherings where he would invite others to come and hear his teachings about the same true history of the world. It said that he even handcrafted an intricate model of the universe, what he called the Great Celestial Planet Exhibition. It was made of wire and wood and paper and wax, and he placed it right in the middle of his makeshift altar down there in his basement. But at the core of so many cults is a business model, and for Benny, his was healing. There were hexes and packets of mixed up herbs that people could buy from him, all promising to aid in the healing of various illnesses. He even offered animal sacrifices for a fee, for those customers who needed something a little bit more powerful than a potion, I guess. But healing of this sort was a gamble. Some people purchased his services and found what they were looking for, but many did not. And as the years went on, that sort of business model has a way of creating something new: disgruntled customers. All of it was bound to catch up with Benny. At least that was the assumption most people would make. The trouble is, Benny wasn't alone. In fact, American culture at the time was a hotbed of groups just like his, and there's a lot we can learn from a brief study of a few. Although none of it bodes well for our friend, Benny Evangelist. The world that Benny Evangelist lived in was filled with others just like him. Actually, they ran the spectrum, from brushing right up against the edge of normal accepted religion to far out on the fringes of what was even considered normal. There were people like Billy Sunday, for example, a former professional baseball player who traded in one touring life for another, traveling the country as a fire and brimstone preacher whose message of temperance is thought to have helped spark the Prohibition. Or how about the House of David, a commune that was founded in Michigan in 1903? The folks who started that, a couple named Benjamin and Mary Purnell, prove that Benny wasn't even the only cult leader by that name in Michigan. Their group, though, followed the teachings of a different prophet, Joanna Southcott, although she did receive her information the same way Benny did, through visions. Then there was Margaret Matilda Wright Brown, who started having visions of her own in 1916 that focused a lot on doomsday stuff. Her teachings quickly grew her community to over 1,000 followers, but fizzled out years later with flavors of elaborate fraud and attempted murder. Out in Kansas City, there was the Adam God cult started by James Sharp in 1903 after he witnessed a meteor crash and believed that it was the Holy Spirit giving him a mission to preach a special message, which, if you're paying attention, probably feels a bit familiar, doesn't it? The Adam God cult drew a ton of followers and eventually settled on a farm that was gifted to them by a wealthy member. By 1906, they were carrying guns and starting trouble, and 2 years after that, it all ended in a violent shootout that took 5 lives. The founder, James Sharp, and his wife, of course, survived. And these are just a small sampling of the seemingly countless groups like Benny's that were out there in the early parts of the 20th century. Maybe it was the growing class divisions that made it possible. Perhaps it was the Great Depression. My guess is that it was a combination of a lot of those things and more. One European newspaper reporter asked the rhetorical question in an article around 1927, how do Americans and English residents of the Riviera amuse themselves? They join cults. And honestly, if you read about enough of them, it really does start to feel like it was becoming America's pastime, which leads us back to Benny Evangelist. He might not have been the only prophet out there in the market, not even the only one in Michigan for that matter, but he was having success. But like I said before, not every customer was walking away happy. Yes, some were, and those people stuck around, even more convinced than ever that Benny's healing powers had really chased away their medical problems. But there were just as many who felt that he had failed them. It's easy to feel their frustration, too. Benny was apparently charging $10 per session, and while that's probably what a lot of people today spend on coffee and a bagel each morning, it was roughly 2 days pay back then, the equivalent of about $300. It was a big sacrifice, and so when it didn't pay off, people got upset. Making that even more bitter of a pill to swallow was Benny's big new house. He'd come a long way from his arrival in America a few years before, and some of that had to do with his real estate ventures. But what most people saw was a guy who was making a fat profit off of their suffering. 3587 St. Auburn Street was the address. Benny lived there with Santina and their 4 children, who ranged from 18 months old to 8 years old. It was a busy house where family life was mixed with work, both the normal stuff and the occult. Everyone knew where Benny the Healer lived, which is why on the morning of July 3rd of 1929, a man named Vincent Elias showed up and knocked on their door. And what happened as a result would shake the community to its core. Vincent didn't kill Benny. I know that's what you were expecting to hear, so I thought I would get that out of the way right away. No, Vincent had simply paid a visit because he and Benny were about to wrap up some real estate business. They knew each other well and were colleagues and friends. What he found when he knocked on the door and let himself in was a scene of absolute horror. No children came running to greet him, so he turned to Benny's first-floor office and stepped inside. Benny was there, seated at his desk, but he was slumped over in a pool of blood. Oh, and his head? It was on the chair beside him. Vincent immediately called for the police. It said that nearly the entire homicide squad from Detroit rushed to the scene, and when they arrived, they started investigating the rest of the house. Upstairs, the bodies of all 4 children, as well as Santina, were found brutally murdered. Benny might have been the only one who had been decapitated, but that doesn't mean that the others didn't die horrible deaths. But I'll just leave it at that. The killer, however, hadn't been neat and clean. There was no attempt to conceal their movement throughout the house, with bloody shoe prints marking each of their steps. The police even found a bloody fingerprint. You don't have to watch a lot of murder mystery shows to know how sloppy that was. Of course, the first assumption was that some disgruntled member of Benny's cult had shown up in anger and killed the entire family. As we've already learned, he was getting rich off of other people's misfortunes, and that sure does sound like the sort of life that leads to an unhappy ending. It didn't help that there were a lot of occult objects found inside the house, painting a vivid picture for the police about who Benny really was, so it was a safe assumption. But even though they asked the entire neighborhood and offered a big $1,000 reward, no one had anything useful to offer them. They did also toy briefly with another theory, though. A note was found in the house that basically said, "This is your last chance." Some people felt that it had the trappings of extortion, a common element found in a criminal organization known as the Black Hand. And yes, the Black Hand had spent years preying on well-off Italian immigrants. But by 1929, they had faded away thanks to the growth of a new group, the Mafia. To the police, the letter felt like an amateur's attempt to frighten Benny to hand over money, not the type of person who would kill a family of 6 in cold blood. The final theory was about a mysterious demolition crew that Benny was buying some reclaimed lumber from. In fact, just the night before, he had called a watchman at a house the demolition crew was taking apart so that he could set up a time the next morning for them to deliver the wood to his house and receive payment. Some thought that maybe they showed up the morning of July 3rd and just decided it would be easier to kill everyone and take the cash. I don't know. That seems weak to me. They were probably much more likely to simply haggle the price higher. They had a business to run after all, and if they killed all of their customers, that business would fall apart. And that was the result of their investigation. 3 separate theories, no arrests, and no answer to the question of who truly killed the Evangelist family. The only witness that ever turned up was the family dog, who was found on the porch of a neighbor a few months later. The poor pup's reputation preceded it too, and the woman refused to take it in and adopt it. And obviously the police weren't able to get any useful information out of it either. The family's funeral service was held 3 days after their bodies were discovered, on July 6th. Over 3,000 people attended, although I have to wonder how many were there because they loved and respected them, and how many showed up to watch their anger and frustration be buried 6 feet below in the grass of the cemetery. And as far as we know, their killer was never brought to justice. Humans have always been drawn to those who offer answers. Exactly how that desire has played out over the centuries is a varied and flavorful collection of groups that have left their mark on history. From the Hellfire Club's debaucherous gatherings of society's elite to those struggling to make the most of their lives, cults have always been a vendor designed to provide what people are looking for. Most of them, though, leave those questions unanswered. And in the case of Benny Evangelist and his faithful followers, where the goal was physical healing, it ended somewhere worse: blood. Now, I could tell you that their house on St. Auburn Street was eventually torn down, but you probably know better than to assume that means that the story has faded away. Events like that have a way of living on, even when everyone involved no longer is. Legends, whispers, rumors, all of it keeps them alive. But for Benny Evangelist, there's one more enticing detail that's kept people coming back time and time again to study the mystery. A little while ago, I mentioned that Benny had a friend back in York who worked with him at the rail yard there. His name, as I said, was Aurelius Angelino. And not only was he a fellow Italian immigrant, but he actually came from the same hometown back near Naples. And both men were obsessed with the occult. But here's the thing I didn't tell you. 10 years before the brutal murder of Benny and his entire family, Aurelius Angelino gathered up his twin 4-year-old boys and killed them while his wife was making dinner. Similar to Benny's killer, Angelino used an axe. And similar to Benny's crime scene, the police found a single bloody fingerprint. Now, Angelino was caught red-handed, in the truest sense of the word. And because his behavior wasn't viewed as sane by people, he was sent to a psychiatric institution for the criminally insane. And then, 4 years later, he escaped. And I know what you're thinking. What if Angelino was angry that Benny left town and made a better life for himself? Perhaps he followed after him to Michigan and found his old friend at the center of an occult gathering wielding the power of a true prophet. And maybe he was overcome with jealousy, leading him to kill Benny's entire family. And that could be it. But there's one more detail that's left investigators and researchers confounded and stumped for decades, because it points to a timeline and a chain of events that no one is prepared to unpack. That somehow, in some way, Angelino didn't kill his own kids back in 1919, and that Benny's 1929 murder was an act of revenge, not jealousy. And that detail, the bloody fingerprint found in Angelino's house in 1919, was an exact match to someone he knew very well. It was the fingerprint of Benny Evangelist. William Morgan was trying to get ahead in life. Born in 1774 in Virginia, he worked as a bricklayer and a stonemason, work that eventually pulled him north to New York. He seemed like the kind of guy who might settle down. He had a wife and 2 kids after all, but the only reputation he really had was that of a drunken drifter. He would pursue one business venture only to fail, pack up his household and move on to the next, rinse and repeat, and that was his life for a very long while. Honestly, reading about his early life makes me feel like one of the few respectable qualities the man possessed was his determination and confidence. William was sure that he could find a way to put himself on the map, to make something of himself. And in a way, he eventually did, just not the way he intended. It happened when William was chatting with a friend of his named David Miller, who ran a struggling newspaper. Now, the two men had a lot in common. Both of them were horrible at running businesses, both firmly believed that they were destined for greatness, and both had very few rules about how they were going to achieve it, which I'm sure you'd agree is not a healthy combination. William had an idea, though. All around him, he kept hearing about a secret society that seemingly controlled his entire world. They were embedded deep within the government of the newly born United States of America, and they used that power to become the wealthiest folks around. Who was this group? The Freemasons, of course. Now, I highly doubt that there's anyone out there who hasn't at least heard of the Freemasons. A full 1/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were members. So were other significant Americans, both then and now. George Washington, Mark Twain, Paul Revere, and Shaquille O'Neal? Anyway, William's new business idea was really simple. He was going to infiltrate the ranks of the Freemasons, learn all of their incriminating secrets, and then write it up as a book, which David Miller would print and sell. It smelled like easy money to these men, so they got right to work. William did indeed sneak in, pretend to be a member, and gain access to all sorts of juicy secrets. And he did, in fact, write it all up for publication. But he and David were so proud of the progress they were making that they actually bragged about it all over town. And soon enough, the Freemasons found out about it, and they set out to stop them. At first, it was just harassment from the Masons and their community. Angry words, threats of violence, that sort of thing. It was posturing, nothing more. Except that posturing escalated quickly. On September 8th of 1826, a group of Masons tried to destroy David's print shop. 2 days later, the Masons set fire to the homes of both men. And then the following day, William Morgan was arrested on false charges. Basically, the local tavern owner, probably a Mason himself, claimed that William had borrowed a shirt and never brought it back. Once that charge was dropped, William was arrested again, this time for failing to pay a tab in the same tavern. A tab, by the way, that was just $2. Yeah, the Masons were angry, and they were pulling at any string they could find to unravel William and David's business plan. On the night of September 12th, a huge crowd of Masons showed up at the jail where William was being kept, and they demanded to pay his bail and take him into their own custody. The jailer's wife was the only one on duty at the time, and she really did try her best to brush them away, but things got pretty heated and she gave in to save her own skin. And honestly, I could not blame her one bit. Those Masons, though, dragged William out into the night while another group visited his wife. They told her that they would let her see her husband, but only if she handed over the unpublished manuscript. Afraid for his life and her own, she did what they asked. They took it, and then they sent her away. Her husband, William, was never seen again. That same night, another group of about 50 Masons kidnapped David Miller and locked him up in an undisclosed location. Even still, a bunch of his friends managed to track him down and break him out. And with that, a very wild night came to an end. Now, from one point of view, the Freemasons got what they wanted, right? They put an end to a critic who had threatened to expose their secrets. In fact, they made him disappear completely. But from another perspective, they really made a mess of things. Why? Because a secret society doing criminal stuff to stay secret didn't exactly endear itself to the general public. Soon enough, news spread, and as a result, an anti-Mason movement sprang up. Not locally, nationally. How massive was this movement? Well, a new short-lived political party popped up called the Anti-Masonic Party. Sitting President John Quincy Adams even felt that it was necessary to announce that he had never been, nor never would be, a Mason. Their recruitment numbers, as a result, dwindled, and within a few years, the organization was reduced to a shadow of its former self. And in the middle of that storm of bad PR, David Miller saw his next best opportunity. He rewrote the book from notes and memory and published it anyway, which, considering the harassment he had already suffered, was pretty brave. And the response from the Masons? Not a single word. David Miller's tell-all expose went completely unanswered. As always, folks, thank you so much for watching. Credits for today's episode are in the description below. Lore has been a podcast since 2015 with 400 million downloads to date. You can learn more about this show, plus the book series and the television adaptation over at lorepodcast.com. And of course, be sure to click the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you don't miss future episodes. Oh, and if you like this one, click the thumbs up. You can also follow this show on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Just search for Lore Podcast, all one word, and then click that follow button. And when you do, say hi. I like it when people say hi. And as always, thanks for watching.